everyone. Welcome to the first Options Supported Living All Hands meeting of 2021.
Woohoo! We did it!
We did it. We're here. It's 2021. It's not 2020 anymore.
Out with that 2020.
Right. That dumpster fire's gone, and now it's just gardens and candy and good things.
So one of our first things we want to do is give you a gift. We have coming your way is a shirt, and you'll notice it has a little badge on it, and the badge says resilient. So we just want to acknowledge you at Options for being so resilient. It was a year of change and turmoil and lots of good stuff, but also a lot of just hard stuff, change.
Absolutely.
So we just want to acknowledge you. We want to thank you for sticking with us, and you get your badge now saying you are resilient.
Absolutely. Feel proud wearing it because you deserve it. You hung with your team. You hung with your clients through a year that nobody planned. Nobody had a plan for once it came. And then we just powered through, and things are on the rise. Things are improving. And it's still not a straight line, easy process, but we're going to get there, and we're going to be able to look back and feel really good about who we were during the time and who we are going forward. So we're grateful for you, and we want you to feel celebrated. That being said, we do have some fun stuff coming up in 2021.
Yeah, so maybe you've heard through the grapevine, we are an organization, Compass, now partnered with Options, our sister organization. You get to adopt some of our traditions, and one of our traditions is retreats. Mm-hmm. We love getting together. We love being a community. It's one of our core values is being a community. So you'll see coming out, and if you want to go to our website, you can get there from the Options website or the Compass Cares website, but you can see that we have a multitude of retreats. And if you want to hear more about each of the retreats, we actually have a video where myself and Mary, our marketing and events coordinator, talk about all the different types of retreats. So I encourage you to help your client figure out what our retreats are and see if that's something they would like to participate in.
Absolutely. We hope you do. We'd love to see you there. All right. Well, our first segment of this All Hands session is with your own beloved leader, Melanie.
Yep. So stay tuned as she's going to talk about some specific things that are available to you, Options.
Hey Options team, it's Melanie Anderson, director here at Options. So great to see everybody, albeit virtually. It's still great to be able to connect this way. Welcome to our first All Hands of 2021. All Hands is something that we had started doing. We have them 3 times a year, and because of the crazy season that we went through last year, we did convert them to be virtual. And just to be on the safe side, we are planning to do virtual all through 2021. We've gotten some feedback from you that many of you really like this format, so we're going to continue it for the rest of this year so that we have some continuity. So we will have All Hands this month in March, again in July, and then in October, so you can be looking forward to that. So you'll watch this video, and then your facilitator will connect with you, ask you a few questions, and just make sure that we're all on the same page. So happy that we've been able to make this pivot and go virtual. So I just wanted to cover a couple of things. You're going to have some great training that's coming, but a few announcements. First is I just want to talk for just a second about, you're probably hearing a little bit about our sister organization, Compass. You've met Sadie and Eric in some videos before, and I just wanted to remind everybody what that is. And so Compass is another organization, and the owners of that organization are involved with us here at Options. And so they are our sister organization, and fortunately for us, they have a wealth of resources and fantastic people that we get to have access to. So you're going to see us starting to do some events together and borrowing each other's training materials and each other's people. I'm so grateful to have them to provide us with lots of encouragement and support and advice and information, structure, systems, you name it. They are really helping us with that. So I just wanted to mention that to you again, because one of the things that's coming up this year is we're going to be joining them on some community retreats. that organization for a long time has had the same value that Options has of community. And they've created certain events that happen so that people within the agency, staff, families, friends, the whole agency community can get together and have opportunities to connect. And this year, there are a series of retreats, and they're going to be all taking place at a place called the Carville Inn, which is near Weaverville. And it is a cute, quaint little place, really nice. And we'll have a series of themed retreats that have really small numbers of people so that we can be safe when it comes to COVID. They have a whole protocol for how they're going to make sure that everybody is safe going. And so there is an adventure themed retreat, arts, crafts, music theme, spa, rest and relaxation, sounds great, and also a spiritual and dreaming themed retreat. So the registration for these retreats is now open. Hopefully you've received an email about that. It is open to, of course, our consumers, and then it's open to you as staff to come and enjoy. I'm actually leading one of the series of retreats, the Arts, Crafts, Music retreat, so I'm hard at work planning that, really excited about it. I've been working with the leaders of other retreats, and they all sound fantastic. So get with your facilitators if you've got a consumer that's interested in going, or if you're interested in going, get some information about how to sign up for that. I'm really looking forward to connecting and being able to do some in person and have a little fun this year. A couple of upcoming events just to let you know about. Every month we're having a virtual Faith Connect, and we're getting together via Ring Central and just talking about things that are going on, supporting each other, praying for each other. Mike Ornelas is helping to coordinate that, and he's just doing a fantastic job. It's something that I've gotten a lot of life out of, and we've just felt like, you know, it's been a hard season, and this was something that people needed and wanted, and so we're happy to continue that every month. So our next one is March 9th at 6 p.m. If you're interested in that, you can contact Michael Ornelas. You can also let me know, and we'll be sure to get you the information so that you can join. Then we have a really fun event coming up. We have a virtual lip sync party on the 11th at 4 o'clock. It is an event that we had planned to have in February, but we rescheduled it because it was timed at the same time as a lot of people were getting their second COVID-19 vaccine, and we just wanted to give people time to feel good, so that, you know, you could have all your energy for the lip sync battle. So I will tell you that I have prepared a lip sync. So even if you just want to join to laugh with me, and just be entertained, and you don't want to do a lip sync, that's fine. But we've got several people that Charles has a whole thing going. He's got costumes, props, the whole thing. So we're taking this seriously. So if you want to have a little fun, join us on the 11th at 4 o'clock for the lip sync battle. And then we're also having a virtual makeover party on March 24th. And there's a flyer that's gone out about that. Candy Stevens has helped us to organize this. And then we've reached out to a couple of people in the community to help as well. And so the idea behind this is just to spend some time together virtually in this format, and, take care of ourselves and maybe change our look a little, and just have a good time doing it. So check out the flyer about that. If you're interested, make sure you RSVP to us as soon as possible so we can plan, make sure we have all the supplies to you that you might need. So I wanted to take a minute and acknowledge that Options is growing and welcome some of our new consumers. Very exciting. In February, we welcomed James and Jordan, and they are roommates. They live in North Highlands, and they've just been so fun to get to know. And we're really feel honored to be serving them. So welcome, James and Jordan. Hopefully you get a chance to say hi to them on a virtual event and soon in person. And then March 1st, yay, here we go, March. We welcomed Jennifer, who lives in Auburn, and She has a lot of interest. She's super fun. And I'm sure she'll join in a virtual event, so you get the chance to meet her pretty soon. And then we also welcomed Nick. And some of you, if you've been on virtual events, you may have met him already. He's going to be at the lip sync battle, so you'll get a chance to meet him there. He lives in like the Greenhaven Pocket area, and we've been enjoying getting to know him as well. And then we've had some movement, a lot of movement in our recruiting and in our team members. So first I want to talk about a little change in the office. We created a new position. It's called the Regional Manager Assistant position, and Nancy is going to be moving into that role specifically. That position is there to provide a lot of the behind the scenes support that we need to be able to do the great service that we're providing. So Nancy, as of this week, has moved into that position, so I'm super grateful for that. Can't wait to have a little bit of help on lots of great projects. Well, that left a vacancy in our team builder or recruiter role, and so we're happy to welcome a brand new person to our administrative team. His name is Ryan Graggs. I'm sure you'll get a chance to meet him soon. So he just started the last week in February, and he's getting to know everybody and getting us all figured out, and he's going to be a great asset to our team. We've hired a ton of people in the last couple of months, and so just going to give a super quick shout out because it's a lot of people, but I just want to officially welcome you to Options. We've had Sage, Olawashan, Essence, Tiajane, Courtney, Spike, Markenza, Natalie. So we now have 3 Natalies. So this is Natalie E. Samantha, Georgie, Feliza, Margie, Crystal. I think that's everybody. That's a lot. That's more than we've added in a really long time. So that's fantastic. Any of you that have helped to refer people, thank you very much. And welcome to all of you. One of our values is honor, and one of the ways that we show honor is by recognizing people that are going above and beyond. So we have our Team Member of the Month award, and we now have a shirt that goes with it. So I'm gonna show you this shirt. You can only get this Options Team Member of the Month shirt if you have been selected as the Team Member of the Month. Pretty cool. So I want to give a shout out to our everybody that's received this honor since the last All Hands. In October, we honored Dominique and Tristan. In November, we honored Natalie G. In December, we honored Soledad. In January, we honored Ali. And in February, congratulations, Rita Devi. We're honoring Rita. So each month, the facilitators and I get together and we just talk about people that are killing it. They're rock stars and they've really made an impact, and we want to just recognize them. So your shirts are on the way if you haven't already received them. Reminder about referrals, since we're talking about bringing new people on. We do, if you refer somebody and we hire them, you'll get $100. When they complete their initial training, you'll get another $25. And when they complete a year at Options, you'll get another $200. Who can't use $325 in their pocket? So think about it. If you know somebody, we are hiring. And the reason is we are getting ready to bring on a couple more clients. So we're growing a little bit more in March and April. So we definitely need some additional people. So let us know who you have. Couple of other things. We are getting really consistent with our annual evaluations. Many of you have gotten to experience that already. And I just want to let you know we do have some ongoing employment requirements that we'll be making sure that you have in order for you to get your evaluation completed. So you'll get an email from Nancy asking you for some things for your file, making sure that you're getting up to date. If those things are not in your file and up to date by the time you have your evaluation, if you've qualified for a raise, you won't receive it. So it's really important that you pay attention to those requests that are coming out to you. COVID, we can't have an announcement right now without talking about COVID. First, I want to thank everybody that worked really hard to get out and get their vaccine. And then just to remind everybody, we are technically still in the purple tier. Our protocols haven't changed. We're asking you to wear a mask when you can't be 6 feet, social distancing, of course, continuing to wash your hands, sanitizing everything, checking your temperature, checking for all of your symptoms. None of our protocol has changed. Please let us know if you need any additional PPEs or you have any concerns or questions. Then just want to thank everybody for the great work in launching our QS Med. It's gone really well. You've done a great job at helping us get things really fine-tuned and updated. I appreciate your patience. In the beginning when you launch something, always a lot of little things that need to be tweaked, and you guys have done a great job. And then lastly, just a reminder about electronic time cards. This is something that we've recently launched. It's available to you in QSP, and it is a requirement. It's not a hope you get to that. It is you need to validate your time cards at the end of each payroll. So in the last day that you've worked in the pay period, or the last day of the pay period is fine. We need you to go in and validate your timesheet. We do need you to go back all the way to January 1st. If you haven't done those timesheets, we need you to go back and validate them. You'll validate, your supervisor will validate. That way, if you catch an error in our calendaring, our scheduling, we can get it fixed before it becomes a payroll error. So we want to work in partnership with you to make sure that things go as smoothly as possible. So if you have questions about your ETCs or electronic time cards, please reach out and ask your supervisor, and they'll get back to you, of course. And then lastly, I just want to show you, I talked about All Hands this month. Every All Hands, we will release a new shirt. So we've got some new options swag for you. So this is the new shirt that's coming out, and when you complete All Hands, this is what you'll get. It says Resilient, the courage to continue, options in supported living. We just felt like everybody needed a badge, a badge of resilience for surviving this crazy season. I'm very proud and very honored for the way everybody at Options has just been incredibly flexible and supportive and understanding, creative during this hard season that I hope we are on our way out of. So that was lots of announcements, lots of things happening. Options is a super exciting place to be right now, and I feel so privileged to be on this journey with you. Thanks so much, and see y'all soon.
All right, well, hopefully that was great information from your regional manager. Now you get a chance to hear from our VP of Operations, Jennifer Bowman. She's going to be talking about COVID and how to stay vigilant.
Hey team, Jen Bowman here, and first I wanted to start by thanking you all for everything that you guys have done over this last year with the COVID pandemic. Everything you've done to keep yourself safe, keep your clients safe, doing extra cleaning within the home, following the different protocols as they rolled out, really just adjusting with different community expectations. So I want to start by saying thank you so much for that. We're not done, but we're hopefully almost there. One of the things though that we do here is we talk about sharpening the saw. And so sharpening the saw is a term that really means that we want to focus on our most important asset. So we want to focus on enhancing and maintaining that asset. And our most important asset is ourselves. And so one of the ways that we focus on that asset is through training and through knowledge and making sure that we all have a lot of really good information that we can use on a daily basis. Attached to this training is a link for the Care Academy COVID training. Now, many of you may have done this training last spring, and some of you have maybe never done this training. So I highly encourage you all to click on the link, go through and do the training, work on getting some more knowledge and really just sharpening your saw.
Thanks, Jen. Great information. Need you to stay responsible, need to stay safe. Really appreciate your passion on that point. But 2020 is not that far behind us, and 2020 did have its share of grief and loss. So we've asked our own resident PhD, Dr. Andy Flaherty, to come and share with us some wisdom about dealing with grief and loss. So he's going to be talking for a little bit here, and I would ask you to give him really good attention, because this is going to be some information that can help you deal with your own loss and pain that you might have experienced last year, but also to help your client as they deal with their own. Take it away, Andy.
Welcome to this presentation on grief and grief management. I'm Andy Flaherty and I'm the training manager. And so today I'm going to be talking with you about grief, about what it is, how it affects us and the people around us, how we can recognize it in our own lives and in the lives of others, and how we can best respond to grief. You know, it's important to recognize that as helping professionals, as professional carers, we deal with a lot of loss and a lot of grief as we love and care for our clients. They face medical challenges, and unfortunately we do lose clients do pass, and so we as professional carers, we have to work through that loss. We have to come to terms with that loss. We have to cope with that loss, and so that's it's kind of the first why. It's the first part of why we wanted to have this conversation today. The second point is that we're living in the age of COVID, and so grief and loss are all around us. We've been confronted with a massive loss of human life. We've seen lives impact across so many different domains. We've all felt to some extent during the season the sting of loss, whether it's unfulfilled plans or things that didn't work out, to the loss of a loved one, to seeing people that we love and care for kind of just deal with fear and anxiety and sickness. It's been a very, very tough season, and so we recognize that we as an organization, as an agency, need to have open conversation about grief and grief management. It's also important to recognize that we live in a society that doesn't have a very high value for talking about death and for talking about grief and for talking about loss. And those things are pretty taboo, and that's not helpful. It's not helpful to avoid having those conversations. It's not helpful to not think about loss, and so it is important to kind of take a good look at grief and how grief affects us, and how we can support each other, and we can support ourselves as we adjust to and as we live with grief and loss. So as way of introduction, I wanted to kind of pose the question, what is grief? Well, on a really, really basic level, grief is the natural response to loss. And that's one of the things that makes grief so difficult, is that we can kind of shove it down, we can kind of distract from it, we can kind of isolate or avoid it, but it's a natural process. And so whenever we have a loss, whenever we have an intense loss, to some degree, we're going to experience a grief response. And so typically, grief is the loss of someone or some living thing that's died. However, it doesn't just have to be the death of a loved one or a family member. We can experience grief and loss anytime we love someone that we cared for, that we were closely connected to, that we worked with, that we were friends with. We also experience grief and loss when we have a loved one or someone we care for face a serious illness. And that process of caring for somebody through a serious medical challenge and the uncertainty of that challenge can, and does in a lot of people, provoke a grief response. Relational abandonment or relational conflict are also situations that as a result of which we might experience quite severe grief and loss. That feeling of having somebody with us, knowing somebody well, having an intimate relationship with somebody, and then they go, and they're no longer in our life. And so that can definitely cause a grief response. We also see that with divorce and family breakdown. that as families are impacted by divorce and separation, sometimes even abandonment, as I just talked about, it's natural for there to be a period of grieving. Another one that's important to talk about and to consider is the loss of a pet. We, certainly in Western culture, we do really, really love our pets. We love our dogs and our cats, or maybe even reptiles, right? But we love our pets, and there's lots of interesting studies about how people will take better care of their pets than they do themselves. And so it's no surprise that the loss of a pet really, really impacts people, and that can prompt grief as well. Part of what we're going to consider today is that we as professional carers, we in the caring profession, we also experience loss when our clients pass on, or when our clients are facing serious illnesses or very, very challenging medical situations. One of the things I mentioned in my introduction was here in Western society, we really don't do a good job of thinking about grief, thinking about death, thinking about the end of life. These are things that can kind of make us very, very uncomfortable. And so we want to push them out of our mind, or we really don't want to focus on them, or we, as a society, as a culture, we kind of idolize youth and health and fitness, but the reality is that all of us are going to face loss, are going to face death, are going to face serious medical challenges across the course of either our life or the life of people that we're close to and that we love. And so it's only quite recently, it's only been 50 years or so, that health professional scientists have studied grief in order to help people better cope with grief and loss. And the most common, or the most well-known and most well-used model of grief is the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model of grief. Now, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, one of my heroes, she was a psychiatrist. She works at the University of Chicago, Swiss-American psychiatrist. And she worked with patients who had terminal cancer. And as a psychiatrist, she was trying to help them adjust to having this life-impacting or life-threatening diagnoses. And she found that very often medical professionals, that the questions and supports that we had for these patients who were facing these issues really weren't the same questions that the patients and the families themselves were dealing with. And this caused Kubler-Ross a lot of frustration. And she really kind of realized over a period of time, as she was doing her work at the U of Chicago Medical School, that very often carers, nurses, social workers, we don't do a good job of helping people understand the grieving process and of adjusting to the loss of a loved one. And so over time, through interviewing people who were experiencing grief and loss, she developed a 5-stage model of grief. Sometimes this model is called the 5 stages of grief, or like I first called it. And so within the model, there are 5 distinct stages that Kubler-Ross theorizes a person works through as we process grief. So the first one is denial and isolation, sometimes just called denial. The second one is anger. The third one is depression. The fourth one is bargaining. And the fifth one is acceptance. What we're going to do for the rest of this half of the training is we're going to think about and consider each of these stages. We're going to kind of look at what they look like, how do we know if we're experiencing them. And so one of the things that's a little bit complicated about the Kubler-Ross model, and I'll get to this when I come towards the end of the training, is that I delineated those stages in a model. But the reality is that that's just the way that people most commonly experience them. But one of the things that Kubler-Ross noticed is that it's kind of an iterative process of working through these stages, and sometimes it can even get interrupted and we can jump back and forward across each of them. But there's there's no universal way through grief. Each of us walks our individual path, and we walk through the stages in a non-linear way, and it's a non-linear process. So the first stage I want to talk about is denial and isolation. And typically, most of the time, so for most people, this is the first stage of grief that they experience. Denial is a defense mechanism, and it's something that happens in our brain, that happens in our cognitive process as a way of pushing or ignoring death and tragedy when it comes close. Thoughts like, there's no way this is happening. This can't be real. Wait, this is happening right now? All of those thoughts are common when we first come into contact, when we first learn of a death or a tragedy. And they're our brain's natural response to something that's very, very difficult to handle. And essentially, the process of denial kind of gives our brain space in which to feel protected. And that doesn't mean that the person that is in denial is kind of walking around pretending that it didn't happen. No, it really looks more like the person has a lot of questions. The person might be having a hard time coming to terms with what's happened. It's also really common to experience feelings of detachment, as if your old life, or the life that you had before you got this news, has suddenly evaporated. And it can be this really strange stage, this really difficult process to come to terms with, because it feels so sudden, and it feels like our old life, our old normal has evaporated. And one of the things that I think is important to consider when we think about denial and isolation is that a lot of people have experienced that with us kind of living in this post-COVID world, where a lot of people reflect on the fact that, oh, I can't wait for things to go back to normal. I'm so looking forward to be able to doing this again. And to some extent, thinking about those things that we used to do, longing for those things that we used to do, is a form of denial. Now, one of the other things with denial is that when we're confronted with the very, very harsh truth of death or of a tragedy, we do want to isolate. And isolation, relational isolation, it's a physical way of reinforcing the psychological dynamic of questioning to push the psychological trauma or the harsh psychological reality of death and tragedy away from us. And so people that are grieving, that are in this stage, relationally might be very, very withdrawn. They might not make eye contact. They might spend quite extensive periods of time on their own. They might report feelings of unreality. They might report feelings as if they're stuck inside a bad dream. And these things are very, very unpleasant experiences, but they're perfectly normal. And all people experiencing grief and loss report these things when it pertains to being in the denial stage. I lost my own grandfather in 2018, November 2018. I was just finishing grad school. I was transitioning to another position at a different university. But for about 5 months, there was this feeling that just kind of hung around my world of being vaguely detached from my life. And it was only through processing, it was only through counseling that I realized. At first I thought I was just overstressed, but it was only through beginning to do some grief work that I actually realized, oh, I'm really in denial, and I'm really having a hard time coming to terms with his loss. It was a very strange experience. It's not an experience that I would want to go through again, but I'm glad I did, because now when I work with people, or I support people, or I interact with people who are in the stages of grief, that feeling of detachment, that feeling of my old life having evaporated, I'm familiar with. And so one of the things to recognize is that feeling doesn't we're not always going to have it. It will resolve, and over time, as we adjust to the new normal, right, to the new post-loss normal, that feeling will dissipate. That means that it will lessen, and it will kind of fade away or evaporate. Anger is the next stage of grief that I want to talk about. And for most people, anger does follow denial and isolation. And so we usually think of anger as the next stage of grief then. And typically when the reality of the situation sets in, when the feelings of detachment, the feelings of unreality, the questioning and the isolation, when they kind of wane, when they kind of drop down, when they drop off, it's very common for these intense feelings of anger to rise up. And our anger can be projected in lots of different places. We can be angry at ourselves, and it's a very, very common experience for people in the anger stage to get frustrated at themselves and towards themselves, and to maybe ask themselves, I could have done more, or I should have done more, or what did I miss, or what should I have done? Sometimes anger is directed at doctors and or other healthcare professionals. Did they really know what they were doing? I think they made a mistake there. It's their fault. And while this can cause some relational turbulence, while the anger stage can be very, very unsettling to go through, again, it's actually another psychological defense against the harsh reality of that loss, tragedy, death, and or trauma. Because the anger after the challenge with denial and of coming to terms with reality, anger kind of gives us a focus, and it gives us a thrust, and it gives us the ability to maybe kind of to push through some difficult things, to maybe take a closer look at what's happened. And so it's important that when we feel anger as a response to grief, or when other people that we know feel anger as a response to grief, that we don't encourage them to repress the anger or to just push it down. We want to help people, and as people that when we go through the grieving process, we want to have positive outlets for our anger. And I'll talk more in the second half of the training about what some of those positive outlets are. But ultimately, it's important to remember that anger does not require us to be vulnerable. And this is a really, we're still talking about the early stages of grief. So this is a really vulnerable, it's a very vulnerable, very, very tender time. And so it's important to have patience for other people that might be going through this stage, because the anger right now is a defense, and it protects them from the fear of more pain and from more loss. And so it's important that we don't engage in fighting with people that are going through anger. I mean, it's also important that when we're going through the stage ourselves, that we don't, and I've already stressed this point, but I can't stress it enough, that we don't direct our anger at people. So the next stage that I want to talk about in the 5-stage model of grief, the Kubler-Ross model of grief, is bargaining. And losing a loved one can cause us to consider any way that we can come up with to avoid the current pain, or maybe it's the pain that we anticipate from a loss. And so what happens is that we try to mentally bargain. We try to come up with a variety of promises or vows or rationalizations as a way of relieving the pain associated with the loss or the impending loss. And so what that might look like, for instance, if we are anticipating the loss of a loved one or someone that we care for, is that people in the bargaining stage will internally, their cognition will look like this. They'll say things like this to themselves: God, if you can heal this person, if you can heal my loved one, I promise you I'll turn my life around. Or it might be just internal vows like, I'll never get angry I'll never get angry if they don't die, or I'll never get angry if they don't leave me. They're all examples of these internal processes that are essentially bargaining. And bargaining is a way of that our brain uses to try and get some semblance of control when we feel out of control from the impact of losing somebody. Now, for some people, it might be less specific than that. It might just be a general sense of wanting a cosmic do-over. What do I mean by wanting a cosmic do-over? It might be that they spend a whole lot of times thinking about what could have been, what should have been, how things should have turned out. Maybe even imagining what the future would have been like with this person or with this pet, or had this relationship carried on. It's exactly the same as rationaling through bargaining. It's a way of trying to get some semblance of control against what is a incontrollable situation. Very oftentimes, if we're talking about the loss of a loved one, a terminal illness, the death of a pet, etc. And so when we're in bargaining, it can be very, very important for us, and it is very, very important for us to talk through the various vows that we're making, the various questions that we have, the various fantasies about how life could have been. Because talking to somebody about that really kind of begins the process of us beginning to identify what is so painful about our loss. But the challenging thing is that there's a lot of reassurance in bargaining, because we can develop our own alternate reality, right? Our own, and it's like denial in that sense. We can develop our own alternative situation in which we are actually powerful, or we feel more powerful, or we feel that we can actually maybe even affect an impossible situation through our own mental rationalizations. So it might be, it's not uncommon. I've had clients talk to me about that feeling of, I know this is completely irrational, but I say things like, or I pray things like, God, I'll stop doing X if you can somehow bring this person back. And even though the person knows that's not rational or not healthy, it's a way of their brain trying to take control of a situation in which the person feels so powerless in the face of usually what is still a very, very intensely painful loss. So moving on to talk about the fourth stage, which is depression. We all experience depression at various points in our life. It's a universal, it's a common experience. And so it's probably the stage that most people are most familiar with, in the sense that we've all experienced this to some degree. And typically what happens is, when the shock, denial, anger, and rationalization process, the previous stages, when they've kind of died down, as we grieve, we're left with the sadness, we're left with the disinterest in life, we're left with sometimes just a very raw emotional pain and impairment to our mood that depression brings. And so typically the symptoms of depression that might show up when someone's grieving: loss of interest in life, this sense of not being able to experience pleasure anymore. Some people describe that as just a feeling of numbness. So they don't really experience sadness, but then they certainly don't experience any pleasure either. And for some people, it might be that they just experience quite intense psychic pain. They just experience very, very intense emotional pain. So they do report quite intense mood disturbance. Some people will report sleep disturbance. That means you might notice them, or they might tell you that they're sleeping too much, or they're sleeping too little. Or for some people, it might look like that they're sleeping, that they're kind of sleeping at odd times, or their sleeping pattern is disturbed. And so what that can look like is that they'll maybe go to bed their regular time at 10, and they'll sleep pretty heavily for like 3-4 hours, and then they'll wake up and it's very difficult to get back to sleep, and then finally they'll kind of just fall back to sleep again, but then have to wake up and then start the day. That disturbance can be very, very, very uncomfortable. I talked earlier about the process of me working through the grief of my grandfather. When after the kind of period of denial, one of the things that kind of started to creep up on me was some sleep disturbance, and I would wake up every hour or so, and I kind of had this happen for about a month or so. It was very, very difficult to deal with. I was You know, I was a busy professor at the time, and so going to sleep, going to bed, and going to sleep, and then waking up every hour was quite uncomfortable. And I just got to the point where with that I had to go and get some medical help from my doctor. And so if you or a loved one or somebody that you know are experiencing sleep disturbance, appetite disturbance, even mood impairment beyond the usual range of your mood, it is really important that you do talk to a medical professional at that point. So I do want to encourage you that if that's happening, there's nothing to be ashamed of. It's really important to get support through this stage of depression, because it can and does affect our physical well-being and our physical functioning. So moving on to talk about the last stage of the 5 stages model, or the Kubler-Ross model, which is the acceptance stage. Now, when people hear acceptance, we sometimes mistakenly think that what's happened is that the person's gotten over the tragedy of what happened. And that's not the case, and that's not what this stage describes. But what it describes is that getting to a place of acceptance doesn't mean we're done grieving, or that we've entirely gotten over what happened. And it's not that we no longer feel the pain of the loss. It just means that we can now comfortably accept the reality of the situation. We can acknowledge that yes, X has happened, this has happened, and we've worked through these stages. But now we feel a degree of acceptance, and we've come to terms with the fact that this has happened. Now that doesn't mean, and I'm being very careful here, that doesn't mean that we're entirely comfortable with what's happened, and it doesn't mean that in order for you to fully feel or to begin to feel acceptance, that you have to be completely okay with what happened, right? There are some things that happen when it comes to loss, when it comes to tragedy, that are always going to cause us to feel discomfort, right? They're always going to cause us some degree of some feelings of being uncomfortable when we think about them, because to some degree we'll never be okay with that. For example, parents who lose a child will very often report that feeling. Yes, they do get to the point of acceptance where they can accept the reality of, yes, this happened, I lost my child. But whenever there's reflection on that, whenever there's reminder of that, whenever there's a trigger, there is this dynamic that it's difficult that it's difficult to remember what happened, right? That there's a feeling of, I'm never going to be comfortable with this, but I can accept that yes, this is reality and this has happened. So that's my kind of long-winded way of describing the process of acceptance, because it's very important to separate what the stage of acceptance is in reality. It's having come to terms with what happened, to this kind of idea that we have in society about, you should move on, you need to get over it, shouldn't they be past this now? All those kind of thought patterns, all those kind of judgments that we sometimes direct against ourselves, we sometimes direct them towards loved ones, they're not helpful, because they, to some degree, they have an aspect of denial, but they're also, they don't respect the natural process. And so when we talk about acceptance, really what we're acknowledging is that I have come to terms with the reality of what's happened. None of my psychological defenses are kicking in to try and help me avoid or help me displace the pain that's coming from the impact of that reality. So the emotional tactics of denial, bargaining, and anger are definitely going to be less present at this stage. But that doesn't mean that when we get to acceptance, it doesn't mean that we should expect to never see those again, because they will come up. The infographic we showed you at first was a circle, and so you could follow how someone kind of moves through the stages, and I described it that way. Well, the infographic I'm showing you now has a circle, but it also has a star within the middle. And that star is important because one of the important things that Kubler-Ross found out about grief is that it is a non-linear process. And so by that, what we mean is that somebody can, or people do typically work through denial, anger, depression, but then it's common for people to jump back to denial. People very often will go through denial, they'll come out of denial and into anger, and then they'll kind of oscillate between anger and acceptance for a while. Or some people find that they will work through denial, anger, depression, bargaining, but then jump all the way back to being angry when they realize that the rationalizations during the bargaining stage don't work and or aren't helpful. So it's important to remember that this is a iterative, non-linear process, and that people can and do, as we experience grief, seemingly move from stage to stage. And that doesn't mean that it's an erratic process, but it does mean that as we work through grief, we can expect that there's going to be some interaction between these stages. They're not, how we experience them is not, it's not entirely static. We can go from denial and isolation, anger, into depression, and then back to denial again. But that doesn't mean that we're starting the process over. It doesn't mean that we've gone back to the beginning of the process. It simply means that within this model of grief, we recognize that grief is a natural process, and as we work through these stages, some of them we might have to and do have to work through several times. And so it's important that as we go through this non-linear process that at times might feel quite random, it might feel difficult to track, our friends might, or colleagues might lose patience with us, we might lose patience with ourselves. It's important to recognize that that is a natural part of the grieving process. And the reality that grief is a non-linear process, it's important to recognize that. And this dynamic of it feels like I'm circling around, going slowly up as I process, or maybe going slowly around and then kind of jumping every now and again. It's a very natural, normative, normal part of the grieving process. And so we've got to understand that this process can't be rushed. And it's important that as helping professionals, as carers, because we are going to face grief and loss, that we support each other through this complicated process of grief. The model's simple, right? There are just five stages, 5 concepts. I think it's pretty easy to understand. But what can be difficult to understand, what can be difficult to track with, is how each individual experiences grief. So moving on, for the next couple of moments, I want us to think about how can we cope with grief. So whether it's grief in your personal life, or maybe as a professional carer, is grief tied to the loss of a client or a situation involving a client. I think there are a couple of things that's really important for us to do in order to cope with grief. And I think the big one is that it's important for us to acknowledge our losses and our feelings of grief. And by acknowledge, there's so much power in actually naming what's going on. And way back at the start of the training, I talked about how it's difficult in our society to talk about death, how we rush through that process, how we feel so uncomfortable with grief and loss and death, and how we can very often avoid people, avoid those situations. So yes, it does take a degree of vulnerability, and it does take a degree of bravery to be able to acknowledge it and to be able to say to people close to you, maybe people on your team one, if you're tracking with that concept, to be able to say, yes, I am experiencing loss and I am experiencing grief. But there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of relief in that. There's a degree of psychological freedom and emotional readjustment that comes from having identified to other people what is actually going on with you, because there's less relational guessing. People now can directly help you. It also asking for help strengthens a relationship, because now within the relationship we both have something to aim at. It also helps people to stop guessing, right? And I know that there's a whole lot of cultural taboos around talking about grief, around displaying grief, but it's important to do this, and it's important to acknowledge, to name your grief, to let people close to you, both personally and professionally, know exactly what's going on with you. And you know, we've got so much understanding, we've got so much time for that. I started this presentation by acknowledging the reality that as helpers, we're all experiencing so much grief right now, whether it's the loss of clients or whether it's in adjusting to the things that we're all missing because of the COVID situation. But there is grief and loss all around us, and so it's important that we model honesty and that we model vulnerability in facing that. How we can cope with grief, another thing that can be really helpful is to connect with people, right? If we're experiencing a loss in our life, to connect with old friends, to maybe touch base with people that we've not talked with for a while. They can be a tremendous support, and very often can be a source of encouragement. They can remind us of quote unquote happier times. Because it is important that we get our emotional needs met. It is important that we develop a new support structure, because very often grief and loss, the tragedy that happens, our support structure, our support system can be impacted. And so pulling in other people, pulling on old friends, is a great reconnecting with people. It's a great way to kind of redevelop that structure. And I'm not saying that you need to completely unburden yourself on people, or I'm not saying that you need to decide, okay, this person is now going to be the most important person in my life. I'm just saying that it's important that we begin to, because grief affects us relationally, that we begin to take a new intentional relational steps. Creating memories and rituals is really, really important when we think about dealing with a loss, and there are a variety of ways to do that. There's very, very informal ways, like remembering somebody through planting a tree, or maybe having a celebratory meal, making the person's favorite food and having some friends over and reminiscing about them. There's a lot of ritualistic power in that, and as humans, I can get into the science of this, but we're intensely ritualistic creatures, right? As we're intensely ritualistic beings, and so having either an informal or a formal way of ritualistically memorializing what happened, it can help us to process, as we've talked about, the complex feelings associated with loss. Some of the more formal things to do are services of remembrance, whatever your faith expression, can be really, really helpful. Intentional spiritual practice that incorporates the memory of the loved one. Is it praying for something that they cared about, or is it that there was a concern that they had, or something that was important to them, and that you take some time to intentionally carry on their work. Say, for instance, they loved animals, they supported the local humane society. Some formal way of kind of carrying that work on is helpful. That's why very often there are endowments and scholarships, even as something as simple as, oh man, this person loved this park, and that this park bench. That's why we now dedicate park benches to people, right? Because it's a way of taking something that was important to somebody, usually environmentally or spiritually, or just a kind of social concern, and help and coming up with a formal way of remembering them and remembering their work. Another way of coping with grief is that counseling or group support can be helpful, and again, that can be either informal or it can be formal. And it can informal, it can look like if there's a few of you that have been particularly affected by the loss of somebody, maybe a loss of a client, just within the current restrictions that we're dealing with, but now we can do all these things by Zoom. Just getting together to talk about how you're feeling can be a very informal way of coping. For some people, formal groups, formal support groups, grief processing groups, grief recovery groups are very, very helpful, and they're very, very effective. And I know at first it might seem a little bit strange to sit down with people that you don't know and talk about your grief, talk about your loss, but there's a lot of power in doing that. It's very, very helpful, and in large part because it normalizes the process, the painful process that we're going through, to hear the stories of other people. We feel less alone. One of the things that makes the stages of grief very, very difficult is that we feel all alone. And so this process of grief counseling in a group setting can be very, very helpful. Some of you might benefit from individual professional counseling, whether that's formal clinical counseling or just pastoral counseling. Those options can really, really help. If any of these things really, really strongly resonate with you, and you're like, yeah, Andy, I would like to talk to somebody. I think I would benefit from, from sitting down and talking about that, whether formally or informally, whether you want it to be pastoral or maybe more clinical. We can help you with that as an organization. And so please don't be a stranger. Please reach out to your CF. If you have my email, feel free to reach out to me. If you don't want to let your CF know and you just want to reach out to me, you can get my email from your CF. Please let us know that you need help, because we don't want anybody, certainly not, it's a point I've really labored, certainly not in the current climate, to be struggling with the stages of grief and the challenges associated with grief. So please let us know. Okay, so fifth and finally, how can you cope with grief? It's important to give yourself time, grace, and to practice taking care of yourself. One of the things I've talked about is that the stages are non-linear, and you can move through them, and you will move through them several times. That it takes a lot of patience. Things get more complicated when we fight the process or when we avoid the process. And so taking care of ourselves, cultivating wellness habits, good sleep habits, good diet habits, getting outside, getting fresh air, exercise, all those wellness habits help us to cope with the psychological strain of the stages of grief. And so I'd really, really encourage you to do that. Again, that's another thing where we as an organization do have support, and if you feel like you need extra help, please let us know. Okay, so brings us to the last section of today's training, and that is how can we help others with grief? One of the things I've really tried to identify, I've really tried to emphasize, is that during this time, so many of us, I would say the majority of people to some degree, are experiencing grief and loss, and are experiencing the stages of grief to some extent. And so I think it is important to reflect on how can we help others? How can we help support those people around us? How can we help them move through the stages of grief? How can we help them come to terms with loss? And I think also I think it's important to reflect on how we can help others, because as helping professionals working in the industry that we work in, we're always going to experience loss. We're always going to experience the loss of clients. We're always going to experience medical challenges and medical difficulties in the lives of our clients. And so I'm seriously thinking about how we can support each other as helping professionals deal with those types of situations. So I think the most important thing is it's really, really important to not diminish the grief of other people. You know, I've talked a lot about how as a society we don't do grief, we don't grieve well, and so very often we can want to move through grief quickly. We can want to just get over it, and so we've got to be very, very sensitive in how we talk to other people, even if we have judgments about how we think they should be handling a certain situation. It's really, really uncomfortable. It's really, really unhelpful. It puts people under a lot of pressure to verbally express those things. So it's really important that we don't diminish grief, and it's really important that we don't send those messages to people that minimize their grief and that minimize their emotional response. And we don't ever want to put pressure on people to get over it or to move past it. Those things are really, really unhelpful. It's also unhelpful to avoid direct comparison to your experience. You know, as people, we think it's helpful to say, I understand, or I know exactly what you're going through. And the reality is that, as I've talked about, grief is an individualized process. Yeah, the stages of grief are the same for everybody, but how we experience them, that's moving through the stages, how we experience them is very, very individualized. And so when we give a message like that to people, that, oh, I know exactly what you're experiencing because I went through this, it can and does have the effect of taking away the individual nature of the grieving process. It does send that subtle message of it's not that big a deal. So again, it kind of is a form of diminishing the grief, but it's also it can feel very, very constricting. It can feel very much like that for the person that is experiencing grief, that someone else is coming in and imposing an understanding or imposing an interpretation on what they're experiencing. And really, it's that dynamic of, and we talk a lot about our values, and we want to cooperate with people. Everything we do, we want to do out of relationship and out of facilitating empowerment for people. And so when people are dealing with grief, it's no different. So we don't want to be experts in other people's griefs and in other people's grief, and we don't want to be experts in solving other people's problems. We want to come alongside them. We want to come alongside them as they're grieving and help them to work through the issues connected to their grief and to work through the stages of grief themselves. And so, you know, I've kind of illustrated two things not to do. So what should you do? Well, just reach out. Very often when we know someone's experienced a loss, we feel this pressure to, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. So I want to avoid that, or I want to avoid them. And I think it's really important that we as helpers, we as people that care, we push through that feeling. We push through that feeling of discomfort, and we talk about, we reach out to people, and that we're prepared to talk about their loss. Now that doesn't mean, again, like I said in my first 2 points, that we take the role of expert in their life, or we take the role of expert towards them, but it does mean that we just reach out to them, that we don't pretend that what's happened hasn't happened, that we're prepared to mourn with people who are mourning, that we're prepared to sit with people and be with people, and to have people that are experiencing the intense pain of grief know that we're there for them. It's really important, and we have a very high value for this, is active listening. And so I'd say, you know, how active listening or practicing listening is one of the best things that we can do to help others cope with grief. And so it's really important to just to practice those active listening skills, very, very present, being very, very attentive, using appropriate eye contact, using open body language, and that we use summaries, that we use reflections, that we listen very, very carefully to the people that we love who are grieving, and we allow them space to talk. And it can be hard as helpers. I know as a social worker at times it can be very, very hard, because I want to jump in and I want to fix and I want to offer advice, and I've read this great book, or there's this great resource, or you should watch this YouTube video. All those things are fine, but it's important that we listen, and it's important that we spend a lot of time listening, and it's also important that when we offer advice that we preface it with the phrase of, if it would be okay, I would like to offer you some advice. Or we preface it with, hey, that I know some things that really helps me. If you ever want to have a conversation about those, I'd love to talk about some of those things when you're ready. Again, we're empowering the person, we're giving the person the choice, we're letting them control the process. We're not trying to coerce them or to compel them, as much as that comes from a really, really sincere place at times. And I know that, like, believe me, as a social worker, I feel that often. It's important that when we think about helping others cope with grief, that we connect with the person little and often. And very often in our society, we just don't spend enough time with people. We don't spend enough time with people that we're friends with people that we love and care for. And so sometimes we try and overcompensate for that by spending hours and hours with them. The best strategy in supporting somebody that's going through grief is to have lots of points of touch that happen pretty predictably, that happen pretty consistently, because that way you provide them support over the months of the grieving process. So while we may think that it's noble, well, I spent 8 hours with them last month, right? 8 hours one Saturday. I gave a full Saturday up to sit with them. While that is noble, while that is great, the most helpful thing that we can do is to just send the person a text every day and to just call them every other day. Okay? So when we think about connection, so practice connection with the person that is little, so it's bite-sized pieces, because we don't want to overwhelm them. We don't want to cause our relationship with them to cost them more energy, and we want often or frequent connection with them. And if we can encourage them, support them, help them in taking care of themselves. And sometimes that might mean that we roll our sleeves up and we get practical. We help them clean the house. We go buy them food. We help them with meal prep. It might be that we take them to a medical appointment, but we act in a way that helps them to facilitate taking the best care of themselves, because in the early stages of grief, that can and is very, very difficult for people. So I'm beginning to wrap things up. I think it's important that we kind of consider this question of how long will it take, or this idea of how long will the grief process take. And I've waited to share this information until the end, because I think it is very, very impactful when you hear it, but I needed to build upon this foundation that yes, there are recognizable stages of grief that everybody experiences, but the process is non-linear, and the process can and is highly individualized. And what I mean by that is that each individual will work through the stages of grief a little bit differently than the next person, even though they're going to go through the same stages. So that's why I've left discussion for how long grief takes right at the end, because it builds upon that foundation. And so studies have shown that typically working through grief can take between 6 months to 2 years. And I would probably say more accurately that it can take between 6 months and 2 years for the very acute or sharp symptoms of grief to begin to diminish. I know lots of examples of grief where it's taken much longer. And again, why I'm sharing this right now is because that is highly individualized, like 6 months to 2 years. I would probably extend that out to 6 months to 3 years. The challenge there is that there's a lot of time, so there can be a lot of variability between people, and it's because grief is a highly individualized process. One of the movies that really speaks about this is that I guess it is an old movie now, right? It's the old movie Forrest Gump. And so within this movie, Forrest loses his mom dies, and he just takes off running one day. He's a runner, it's kind of one of the subplots of the film, and he just starts running cross country, and he runs cross country like 2.5 times, I think, or 3.5 times. Anyway, you get the idea that about 3 years has elapsed. And so even in clinical practice, I would tell people that there's a lot of benefit in that scene from that movie. And as cliche as it may sound, I think it wonderfully kind of illustrates the reality that processing through that type of loss, through the loss of losing a parent or losing losing a loved one, a loved family member, that it can take a long time. And so Forrest, at the end of these 3 years, he's been running every day on these kind of cross country runs. He just says, and one day I felt like I stopped running. I felt like going home. And so it doesn't explicitly say it, but the subtext of the scene is that Forrest is done grieving, and he can head home, and all the acute pain associated with the loss of his mom has been processed and has dissipated. And so that process can take time, right? It can take upwards of a couple of years, and even then, and I talked about this earlier, it doesn't mean that just because we've got to that place of consistently being in that place of acceptance, that any negative memory or any negative emotion associated with the event is entirely gone. No, as human beings, we're going to continue to be able to access those feelings, right? The idea is the idea is not to get to the place where we don't feel anything connected to the event that happened. Just that our feelings are in proper perspective, and the acute pain of the feelings of grief and loss has been resolved. And so give yourself time, give other people time. Time is one of the most important factors in making lifestyle adjustments, in recovery from grief, in dealing with difficult emotions or difficult relational issues. But it's very, very difficult because we live in a society that so values the instant, what's instant, and so values the kind of the instant fix or the quick fix or the lose 15 pounds in a month diet, right? Or the feel happier in 2 days, method. The reality is that any real growth or any real healing takes time. So please respect that process. And like I've said, if you're feeling stuck, if you're feeling like you need extra help, please reach out and let us know. And finally, this is a difficult season for us all. And it's a difficult season for us as carers, but especially also the realization that as carers, we deal with loss a lot. And we really don't talk about it enough. And that's part of the purpose of today's training, is to get us to talk about this more and to equip us and to give us common language to help us understand grief, and to help us to understand how we respond to grief, how other people will respond to grief, and how we can best support each other through that process. So it's important that if you need help, please reach out and let us know. And then so finally, along that same theme, it's important that we extend love and support to those of us that just need extra help right now, that are dealing with difficult emotions connected to grief and loss. So thank you. If you have any questions, or if there's anything that you'd like to follow up with, please shoot me an email. I will be more than happy to dialogue about this and to talk about it with you more. So thank you for sticking with me. If you've got any questions, if there's anything you'd like me to kind of unpack a little bit more, or maybe you don't necessarily want kind of to talk about a personal issue, you just want to talk about the subject more, please drop me a line and let me know. I'll be more than happy to talk with you.
Well, thanks, Andy, for sharing. I know this is a difficult topic, and I know many of us have experienced quite a bit of grief and loss this year. So hopefully you found that to be something that you could grab a nugget from, or maybe write down the entire training and just ingest it, because this has been a rough season. And our hearts and our thoughts are with those who have suffered quite a bit of loss and grief this year. So know that we're with you, and hopefully this training was helpful. And if you need to talk to someone, please feel free to reach out to your CF, to our HR department, to anyone, honestly, that you think will be helpful, because I guarantee we want to be helpful if you're struggling with grief and loss.
Absolutely. Don't stay isolated. That's when things get really tough for folks. So open up, connect, and know that we're a community that loves each other, and we're here for you.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Well, that is the conclusion of our 2021 #1 virtual all hands. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for participating. We look forward to hearing from your case facilitator or your ILS manager, what you gleaned from it, how it impacted you. So feel free to share that when you have your next conversation with them.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, we say thank you and we say farewell. We'll see you again next time at our All Hands.
Ciao.
Bye.